Hello everyone, it's Jabbar here. Today's video is a patron request. If you'd like to make a video request of your own, you could do so by becoming a patron. The link to this can be found below.
The typical tribal music. An all too familiar sound in our ears when thinking of or referencing the music of the indigenous peoples of sub-Saharan Africa. A hodgepodge of drums, xylophones, and other combinations of banging on objects to make noise while shouting out vocals. Despite the fact that this type of music is deceptively more complex than it seems, the question still persists nonetheless. From the Sahel all the way to the Cape of Good Hope, was this really the only type of music that existed in sub-Saharan Africa prior to the colonial era? While it is true that African music as a whole does place a much more heavy emphasis on percussion instruments than places like Europe or Asia, it doesn't mean that this was the only extant style on the continent. Despite popular portrayals and assumptions, the African continent hosted a plethora of instruments that didn't just consist of drums, xylophones, or tambourines, but of air, string, and even entirely unique categories of instruments that are almost exclusive to African cultures. These instruments can be found from the Atlantic coast of West Africa all the way to the Cape of Good Hope in South Africa, all the way up through the Horn and everything in between. So to start things off though, first let's review one of the most iconic instruments in the entire world. In the United States, the banjo is an all too familiar instrument with a strong association with southern rural areas. It has a unique and distinct sound that is easily distinguishable from other stringed instruments such as guitars, violins, or harps. However, this unique instrument is not just the product of southern white hillbillies as popularly portrayed. In fact, it actually has its origins in the heart of West Africa, and is a variant of an instrument known as the banjar. The banjar itself is but one of an entire family of similar stringed instruments, primarily produced by the Mande-speaking peoples of the West African Sahel. Despite their resemblance to Western guitars, they are actually more appropriately classified as harps. Among these is the ngoni, another proposed predecessor to the banjo, and is known to have existed since at least the 14th century, from the writings of famous Moroccan explorer Ibn Battuta, when he observed its use during his visit to the royal court of the Mali Empire in the year 1352. However, it most likely originated much earlier. The ngoni consists of a hollowed out gourd, a type of fruit that can take over 6 months to reach the appropriate size. Goat skin is then attached to the opening, before finally the stem and 6 strings are connected. The instrument is described as easy to play as it's virtually impossible to play the wrong note. Other similar instruments collectively known as African harps can be found in the central Congo and the eastern Great Lakes regions of Africa. The kora is another instrument found within this family of West African stringed instruments. Though it shares many similarities with the ngoni, it is much more complex, containing 2 rows of 21 strings in total, and requires a great degree of skill to master. It is also the most popular of West African stringed instruments, used by virtually all Mande-speaking peoples, including the Bambara, Malinke, and Mandinka peoples. The earliest written mention of the kora comes from Scottish explorer Mungo Park in the year 1799. However, as with the ngoni, it most likely predates written records by several centuries. Horns are another overlooked category of instruments that can be found all throughout the African continent, consisting of a wide variety of materials. These include wood, metal, and side-blown animal horns from rhinos, cattle, and elephants, among others. As with other world cultures, the vast majority of African horns have historically been used as signaling devices or for religious rituals. However, this isn't to say that they were never used for music, because they most certainly were in some parts of Africa, and could be usually found being played in the royal courts of various kingdoms. In most cases, horns produced a single sound and lacked adjustment valves. To compensate for this, some cultures have been known to have full ensembles of trumpeters, each using a uniquely sized and shaped horn to collectively produce songs featuring numerous, bold, and diverse tones. The mbira, also known as the thumb piano, is an indigenous African instrument popular throughout the continent, and is but one of many similar instruments that have their origins in Eastern Africa as well as Southern Africa. Collectively, these instruments fall into a category that does not correspond with any of the more popular groups such as chordophones or aerophones. Instead, they are all part of a uniquely and almost exclusively African group of instruments known as lamellophones. The mbira is the most complex of these African lamellophones. It consists of a square wooden base, often hollowed out for sound resonance, and containing 22 to 28 flat, flexible metal tongues laid out in a straight line and fixed on one end, all with various sizes and lengths in order to produce different tones. Occasionally, gourds or other objects are attached to the bottom of these tongues to produce an accompanying rattling sound.
Unlike the Western piano, which uses chords and hammers to strike metal plates, a mbira functions from the plucking or pulling and releasing of tensions on the tines in order to create a sound, in a manner similar to bending or smacking a credit card on someone's arm, though the sound produced by an mbira is a lot more appealing to the ears than the sound of a plastic card. The mbira has been produced in Eastern and Southern Africa for at least 1500 years. There's archaeological evidence at Kumadzulo, Zambia, of strips of iron resembling mbira tines that have indirectly been dated to between 500 and 700 CE. As with the other instruments mentioned previously in this video, the mbira is likely to be much older based on oral histories describing it as being up to 3,000 years old, in addition to older versions likely containing bamboo keys as opposed to metal, with the former likely having decomposed a very long time ago. This should be apparent from the fact that even some modern versions are still being produced with bamboo. In 1586, Portuguese missionary by the name of João dos Santos described an instrument he encountered during his travels, which he called an mbira. Modern music boxes and early record players follow the same basic principles as the mbira and other lamellophones. However, unlike their historical African relatives, they are assisted by pulleys, cranks, and gears that both pluck and twang on finely etched grooves, and on a miniature scale. Lastly, I know that this video was supposed to specifically focus on sub-Saharan African instruments other than drums. There are two unique drums of Africa that deserve an honorable mention, because frankly, they're just awesome. The first of these is the Akan war drum. This unique instrument has a head constructed of leopard skin, with its iconic spotted pattern in clear view. It is not played like any other drum I've ever seen in my entire life, nor does it sound like one either. Instead of simply being beaten, the drumstick is dragged across the head in circular patterns, which produces one of the most intimidating sounds you could ever fathom from enemy war music. This drum is skillfully and expertly crafted to sound like the roar of the leopard that it's made out of.
Like this.
Yeah, imagine hearing thousands of these being played by an army as they march towards you. Personally, I think the only instrument that sounds scarier than this is the Aztec death whistle. And finally, we have another type of Akan drum, which is also crafted by several other West African peoples that looks, sounds, and is played just like an ordinary drum. However, it has the ability to talk. Not like in a literal sense talk, but they have the ability to communicate sentences. More specifically, they're tuned to different tones with adjustable straps and usually played in pairs, one high and one low, to effectively mimic the speech patterns of sub-Saharan African languages, which are largely tonal, meaning the same word can have several different meanings depending on the tone of the voice or the inflection of the voice that's used when saying it. Prior to the modern era, this was effectively the closest thing to a telephone or radio that you could possibly have, useful for sending messages, telling stories, and rallying troops in warfare. Anyway guys, I hope you enjoyed episode 8 of Misconceptions. This was kind of a unique situation, being both a patron request and a Misconceptions video at the same time. Don't forget that you can also make similar requests of your own if you make a pledge on my Patreon. It's the least I can do to show my appreciation for those who support my channel. I'll see you guys next time, and always remember, we don't come from nothing.